Hello and welcome to History Bedtime Stories. Do you know that there's a place in America where time stopped in the year 1590, where an entire English settlement froze in a moment of inexplicable abandonment that continues to baffle us today? Picture walking through the morning mist on Roanoke Island, off the coast of North Carolina, where the salt air still carries the memory of voices that called out in Elizabethan accents, where the wind through the live oaks sounds almost like the laughter of children who were never found. Here, Governor John White returned from a supply mission to England expecting to embrace his daughter Eleanor and meet his granddaughter Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World. Instead, he found empty houses with their contents carefully arranged, gardens tended but abandoned, and a mystery so profound that it has transformed his family into America's first ghost story. The Lost Colony of Roanoke wasn't just a failed settlement. It was a vanishing act so complete that it seems to mock our modern belief that every mystery can be solved, every disappearance explained. This is where our journey begins tonight, at the heart of one of America's most enduring mysteries, the Lost Colony of Roanoke. It's a story that weaves together the grand ambitions of Elizabethan England, the harsh realities of survival in an untamed new world, and the complex relationships between European colonizers and Native American peoples. Most haunting of all, it's a story without an ending, a puzzle that continues to captivate researchers, archaeologists, and dreamers more than 400 years after 115 English men, women, and children simply vanished without a trace. But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple way to support the channel. I am also always curious to know where in the world and at what time are you joining me tonight. So, I would really love to hear from you in the comments. The tale of Roanoke begins not in the windswept coastal islands of North America, but in the opulent halls of Elizabethan England, where dreams of empire danced in the minds of ambitious courtiers and adventurers. Sir Walter Raleigh, a favorite of Queen Elizabeth I, had grand visions of establishing English dominion over the New World, competing with Spain's already lucrative colonial enterprises. The Spanish had discovered vast wealth in Central and South America, filling their coffers with gold and silver, and England desperately wanted its own piece of this colonial pie. Raleigh's interest in North American colonization was both personal and patriotic. Born around 1552 in Devon, he had grown up hearing tales of maritime adventure and had witnessed firsthand the wealth that Spanish treasure ships brought back from the Americas. By the 1580s, he had become one of Queen Elizabeth's most trusted advisors and had been granted extensive lands in Ireland, giving him practical experience in the challenges of establishing English settlements in foreign territories. The political context of the 1580s made American colonization seem not just profitable but strategically necessary. England was engaged in an undeclared war with Spain, with English privateers like Francis Drake regularly attacking Spanish shipping and coastal settlements. Establishing permanent English settlements in North America would provide bases for these operations while also asserting England's claim to territorial sovereignty in regions that Spain considered its exclusive domain. In 1584, Raleigh received a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth that granted him sweeping powers to explore, colonize, and govern any lands in America not already occupied by Christian princes. This document, which would prove to be both a blessing and a burden, gave Raleigh essentially unlimited authority over any settlements he might establish, but it also made him personally responsible for their success or failure. The charter reflected the harsh realities of 16th-century colonial ventures. Raleigh was required to establish a settlement within 6 years or forfeit his rights. He had to provide all funding and supplies for the expeditions from his own resources, with the Crown providing only legal authority and military protection. Most significantly, any colonists who settled under his charter would remain subjects of the English Crown, establishing a legal framework that would have profound implications for the development of English colonial society. Armed with this royal mandate, Raleigh immediately began planning what would become the first of several expeditions to the coast of North America. He chose as his target the region that the Spanish called La Florida, but which extended far north of what we now know as Florida, encompassing the entire southeastern coast of what would become the United States. This area was largely unexplored by Europeans, though Spanish ships had sailed along the coast and Spanish missionaries had established temporary settlements as far north as Virginia. The first Raleigh expedition departed from England in April 1584 under the command of Philip Amatus and Arthur Barlow, two experienced sea captains who had served with distinction in Ireland and in operations against Spanish shipping. Their mission was purely exploratory, to scout the American coast for suitable sites for permanent settlement, to make contact with Native American peoples, and to assess the economic potential of the region. After a voyage of several weeks, the expedition made landfall in July 1584 at what they described as a chain of sandy islands surrounded by shoals and protected by barrier reefs. The location they had discovered was the outer banks of present-day North Carolina, a string of narrow barrier islands that protected the mainland coast but posed significant navigational challenges for large ships. Amatus and Barlow were immediately struck by the abundance and beauty of the region. Their written reports, which Raleigh would later use to promote colonial ventures, described a land of incredible fertility and natural wealth. The islands were covered with dense forests of cedar, pine, and cypress. Grapevines grew so thickly that the explorers could barely penetrate some areas on foot. The waters teemed with fish, and flocks of waterfowl darkened the sky during their migrations. Most significantly for future colonial efforts, the expedition made peaceful contact with local Native American peoples, specifically members of the Roanoke tribe who lived on the island that would give its name to the future colony. The English were welcomed by Wingina, the Werowance or chief of the Roanokes, who showed genuine interest in establishing trade relationships and appeared curious about English technology and customs. The cultural exchange that took place during this first expedition provides fascinating insights into both English expectations and Native American realities. The English were impressed by the sophistication of Roanoke society, particularly their agricultural techniques and their detailed knowledge of regional geography. The Roanokes cultivated maize, beans, and squash using methods that produced abundant harvests in the sandy coastal soils. They had developed complex systems for managing coastal resources, including seasonal fishing camps and controlled burning of forest areas to encourage the growth of plants that attracted game animals. Barlow's written account of this first encounter reveals both genuine admiration for Roanoke culture and typically European assumptions about the relationships between civilized and primitive peoples. He described the Roanokes as naturally generous and hospitable, noting that they shared their food freely and showed great curiosity about English weapons, tools, and clothing. At the same time, his report assumes that the Native Americans would naturally want to adopt English customs and would welcome the establishment of permanent English settlements as opportunities for trade and cultural advancement. The English explorers were particularly struck by the Roanoke's apparent lack of formal political hierarchy as Europeans understood it. While they recognized Wingina as a leader, they noted that decisions seemed to be made through consensus rather than by royal decree. This observation would later create significant misunderstandings when English colonists attempted to negotiate formal treaties and land agreements with people whose political systems operated on fundamentally different principles. Two young Roanokes, Manteo and Wanchese, agreed to return to England with the expedition, beginning a cultural exchange that would have profound consequences for future colonization efforts. These two men represented different perspectives within Roanoke society about the appropriate response to English contact. Manteo was generally favorable to English settlement and saw opportunities for mutual benefit through trade and alliance. Wanchese was more skeptical and would later become a vocal advocate for resistance to English colonization. The arrival of Manteo and Wanchese in London in the autumn of 1584 created a sensation in English society. They were presented at court, met with Queen Elizabeth herself, and became living symbols of the exotic new world that Raleigh promised to bring under English control. Their presence helped Raleigh secure additional funding for future expeditions and generated widespread public interest in American colonization. Raleigh's promotional campaign for American colonization was sophisticated and multifaceted, reflecting his understanding that successful colonial ventures required not just royal support but popular enthusiasm and private investment. He commissioned Richard Hakluyt, one of England's leading geographic writers, to produce a detailed analysis of the benefits of American colonization. Hakluyt's Discourse of Western Planting, completed in 1584, argued that American colonies would provide England with valuable raw materials, create markets for English-manufactured goods, reduce unemployment by providing opportunities for surplus population, and serve as basis for attacks against Spanish shipping. The promotional literature that Raleigh sponsored painted an almost utopian picture of America as a land of unlimited opportunity where English settlers could prosper without the social constraints that limited advancement at home. These descriptions emphasized the abundance of natural resources, the fertility of the soil, the healthfulness of the climate, and the supposed willingness of Native Americans to accept English authority in exchange for the benefits of European technology and Christianity. By the spring of 1585, Raleigh had assembled the resources for a much more ambitious expedition designed to establish a permanent settlement rather than merely explore the coast. This second expedition was placed under the command of Sir Richard Grenville, an experienced military officer who had served with distinction in Ireland and had participated in several privateering expeditions against Spanish shipping. The 1585 expedition was significantly larger and better equipped than the previous year's reconnaissance mission. Grenville commanded 7 ships carrying over 600 men, including soldiers, craftsmen, farmers, and gentlemen adventurers seeking their fortunes in the New World. The expedition also carried extensive supplies of weapons, tools, building materials, and provisions intended to sustain the colonists through their first year in America. The decision to establish the settlement on Roanoke Island reflected both the advantages and limitations of the site that Amatus and Barlow had discovered the previous year. The island was large enough to support a substantial settlement while still being defensible against potential attacks. Its location within the protective barrier of the Outer Banks provided shelter from Atlantic storms and made it difficult for Spanish ships to approach without being detected. The surrounding waters offered abundant fishing, and the island's soil appeared suitable for agriculture. However, Roanoke Island also had significant disadvantages that would become apparent only after colonists attempted to establish permanent residence. The island's isolation made it difficult to maintain contact with England, as large ships could not safely navigate the shallow waters and shifting sandbars that surrounded the Outer Banks. The sandy soil, while suitable for some crops, lacked the fertility that agricultural settlers required for long-term sustainability. Most critically, the island's water supply was limited and brackish, creating health problems that would plague every settlement attempt. Grenville's expedition reached Roanoke Island in late July 1585, after a voyage marked by both success and conflict. En route to America, the expedition had captured several Spanish ships, providing valuable plunder that helped offset the costs of colonization, but also announcing English intentions to anyone who might be watching. Upon reaching the Carolina coast, Grenville had explored several potential sites before deciding to proceed with Raleigh's original plan to settle on Roanoke Island. The establishment of the first Roanoke colony reveals the complex challenges that faced European colonists attempting to create permanent settlements in North America. The colonists brought with them detailed plans for the layout of their settlement, including fortifications, houses, workshops, and agricultural areas. They also brought assumptions about how colonial societies should be organized that often proved incompatible with American realities. Ralph Lane, who served as governor of the 1585 colony, was a military officer with extensive experience in Ireland but no background in colonial administration or agriculture. His leadership style reflected military priorities of discipline and defense rather than the consensus-building and diplomatic skills that colonial situations often required. Lane's approach to relations with local Native American communities would prove particularly problematic, as he interpreted diplomatic protocols through military rather than cultural lenses. The colonists who remained at Roanoke when Grenville returned to England in late 1585 faced immediate challenges that their planning had not adequately anticipated. The supplies they had brought were insufficient for a full year, particularly given the larger number of people who had actually settled compared to original projections. The agricultural techniques they had learned in England proved poorly adapted to coastal Carolina conditions, resulting in crop failures that left the colony dependent on trade with Native American communities for basic survival. Relations with the Roanoke tribe, which had begun so promisingly during the 1584 expedition, deteriorated rapidly under Lane's governance. The cultural misunderstandings that had been minor curiosities during short-term contact became serious problems when English colonists expected to establish permanent residence in territories that the Roanokes considered their ancestral homeland. The English colonists operated under legal and cultural assumptions that land ownership was individual and absolute, established through formal purchase or royal grant. They expected to be able to fence agricultural areas, build permanent structures, and exclude others from territories they considered their property. The Roanokes, like most Native American peoples, understood land use rights as collective and seasonal, with different communities having rights to use particular areas at different times for specific purposes. These fundamental differences in understanding property rights led to increasingly serious conflicts as English colonists attempted to expand their agricultural areas and establish exclusive control over fishing and hunting territories. What the English interpreted as theft or trespassing, the Roanokes understood as legitimate use of traditional territories according to customary practices that had operated successfully for generations. The situation was further complicated by the colonists' dependence on Native American food supplies during their first winter. Lane's military background had taught him to view such dependence as a dangerous vulnerability that needed to be eliminated as quickly as possible. His efforts to force favorable trade agreements and to establish English control over regional food distribution networks were interpreted by Native American communities as attempts at political domination rather than legitimate commercial relationships. Wingina, who had initially welcomed English settlement as an opportunity for beneficial trade relationships, found himself caught between his own people's growing resentment of English behavior and his recognition that open conflict would likely result in devastating losses for Native American communities who lacked European weapons and military technology. His attempts to maintain peaceful relations while protecting Roanoke interests required increasingly complex diplomatic maneuvering that the English colonists interpreted as deception and treachery. The cultural exchanges that took place during the 1585 to 1586 period provide valuable insights into how both English and Native American societies understood cross-cultural relationships. The English, drawing on their experiences in Ireland and their theoretical knowledge of Roman colonial practices, expected to establish clear hierarchies with English authority at the top and Native American communities serving as subordinate allies or subjects. They assumed that superior English technology and military power would naturally lead to Native American acceptance of English political leadership. The Roanokes and other coastal Algonquian peoples, however, understood intercultural relationships in terms of reciprocity and alliance rather than dominance and submission. They were willing to share territory and resources with English settlers in exchange for access to European trade goods and potential military support against their traditional enemies. They were not willing to surrender their political autonomy or accept English authority over internal tribal affairs. These conflicting expectations came to a head in the spring of 1586 when Lane became convinced that Wingina was planning an attack against the English settlement. Modern historians debate whether such an attack was actually planned or whether Lane misinterpreted normal diplomatic and military preparations as hostile intentions. What is certain is that Lane decided on a preemptive strike against the Roanoke leadership, launching a surprise attack that resulted in Wingina's death and the collapse of the diplomatic relationships that had made English survival possible. The killing of Wingina marked the end of any possibility for peaceful coexistence between the English colony and local Native American communities. The colonists found themselves isolated and increasingly desperate as their food supplies dwindled and their ability to obtain provisions through trade disappeared. Their agricultural efforts had largely failed, their fishing was inadequate to support the colony's population, and their attempts to gather wild foods were hampered by their unfamiliarity with local ecosystems. Lane's written reports from this period reveal the psychological toll that isolation and desperation took on the colonists. Many of the gentlemen adventurers who had joined the expedition expecting quick profits became disillusioned and demanded to return to England. The craftsmen and farmers who had committed to permanent settlement found themselves unable to practice their trades effectively without proper materials and markets. Even the soldiers, who were presumably prepared for hardship, suffered from malnutrition and disease that reduced their effectiveness as a fighting force. The colony's salvation came in an unexpected form when Francis Drake's fleet arrived at Roanoke in June 1586. Drake had been conducting a highly successful privateering expedition against Spanish settlements in the Caribbean and was returning to England laden with treasure when he decided to visit the English settlement that he had heard about through court connections. Drake's arrival presented the colonists with a difficult choice. He offered to provide them with additional supplies and to leave ships that would allow them to maintain better contact with England. At the same time, he was willing to evacuate any colonists who wanted to return home immediately. The decision was made more urgent by a severe storm that damaged some of Drake's ships and made extended harbor time at Roanoke dangerous for his fleet. After brief consultation, Lane and the majority of colonists decided to abandon Roanoke and return to England with Drake's fleet. This decision was influenced by their deteriorating relations with local Native Americans, their inadequate food supplies, their failed agricultural efforts, and their isolation from English support. The evacuation was conducted hastily, with many supplies and equipment left behind that would have been valuable for future colonization attempts. The abandonment of the first Roanoke colony was seen by Raleigh as a temporary setback rather than a fundamental failure. Lane's reports, despite describing serious problems, also emphasized the region's potential for successful settlement under different circumstances. The natural resources were undeniably abundant, the climate was healthful, and the strategic location remained valuable for English imperial purposes. Raleigh immediately began planning a third expedition that would correct the mistakes of the previous attempt. He recognized that the 1585 colony had failed primarily because of poor leadership, inadequate supplies, and diplomatic mismanagement rather than fundamental problems with the location or the concept of American colonization. The new expedition would be larger, better equipped, and organized along different principles that would, Raleigh hoped, ensure permanent success. The planning for the 1587 expedition reflected lessons learned from the previous colony's failure. Instead of focusing primarily on military personnel and gentlemen adventurers, Raleigh recruited families with agricultural experience who were committed to permanent settlement rather than quick profit. These colonists were promised land ownership and local self-governance rather than the military hierarchy that had characterized Lane's administration. John White was chosen as governor of the new colony, bringing to the position both artistic skills that would provide valuable documentation of American conditions and administrative experience that Raleigh hoped would allow for more effective leadership. White had participated in the 1585 expedition as an artist and mapmaker, producing detailed illustrations of Native American life and Carolina geography that remain valuable historical sources. His artistic background suggested the observational skills and cultural sensitivity that might enable better relations with Native American communities. The 1587 expedition included over 100 colonists, including 17 women and 9 children, making it the first English attempt at establishing a truly permanent settlement in North America. The inclusion of families signaled English intentions to create a self-sustaining colonial society rather than a temporary military outpost or trading station. Among the colonists was White's own daughter, Eleanor Dare, who was pregnant and would give birth to Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America. The decision to establish the 1587 colony initially at Roanoke Island was controversial even at the time. White and some of the colonists preferred to settle in the Chesapeake Bay region, which offered better harbor facilities, more fertile soil, and potentially easier relations with Native American communities who had not been involved in the conflicts that had destroyed the previous colony. However, practical considerations, including the navigational expertise of the ship's pilots and the urgency of establishing settlement before winter, led to the decision to return to the familiar location. Upon arriving at Roanoke Island in July 1587, White and the colonists found the remnants of Lane settlement overgrown and partially dismantled, but the basic infrastructure of houses and fortifications remained usable with repair. This discovery reinforced the decision to reestablish the colony at the same location despite its known disadvantages. The colonists immediately began rebuilding and expanding the settlement, incorporating lessons learned from the previous colony's experiences. The early weeks of the 1587 colony appeared promising. The colonists successfully repaired and expanded the existing houses, established new agricultural areas, and began the process of creating a permanent community. Eleanor Dare gave birth to Virginia Dare on August 18, 1587, an event that was celebrated as symbolic of the colony's commitment to permanent establishment and future growth. However, the colony soon faced familiar challenges with local Native American relationships. Manteo, who had remained loyal to the English through the previous colony's difficulties, was still willing to serve as an intermediary and was formally crowned as Lord of Roanoke by White in an elaborate ceremony intended to establish him as the legitimate Native American authority for the region. This coronation reflected English attempts to create formal political structures that would legitimize their territorial claims while providing a framework for ongoing diplomatic relationships. Wanchese, however, had become a leader of Native American resistance to English colonization and had organized a coalition of tribal groups committed to preventing permanent English settlement. The murder of Wingina and the hostile evacuation of the previous colony had convinced many Native Americans that English colonists represented an existential threat to tribal sovereignty and territorial rights that could not be resolved through diplomatic accommodation. The colonists' attempts to reestablish trade relationships were largely unsuccessful, leaving them dependent on their own resources for survival through the coming winter. Their agricultural efforts, while more extensive than the previous colonies, were still inadequate to support the population, and their fishing and hunting were limited by their unfamiliarity with local conditions and their deteriorating security situation. Within a month of the colony's establishment, White was faced with urgent requests from the colonists to return to England to secure additional supplies and reinforcements. The colonists had discovered that the supplies they had brought were insufficient for winter survival, and their inability to establish reliable trade relationships with Native Americans left them without access to the local food sources that had sustained previous English visitors to the region. White's decision to return to England for supplies was controversial among the colonists and would later be criticized as abandoning the colony at a critical moment. However, White's own account suggests that he reluctantly agreed to make the voyage only after the colonists formally requested his departure, and after arrangements had been made for the colony's governance during his absence. The expectation was that White would return within a few months with supplies and additional colonists, allowing the settlement to survive its first winter and establish permanent roots. White departed Roanoke on August 27, 1587, leaving behind 115 colonists, including his daughter and granddaughter. His parting instructions included arrangements for communication if the colony needed to relocate, with specific carved signs that would indicate their destination. These protocols would prove crucial when White was finally able to return 3 years later under circumstances that no one could have anticipated. White's attempt to secure supplies and return quickly to Roanoke was frustrated by the deteriorating international situation between England and Spain. By the time White reached England in late 1587, preparations were already underway for what would become the Spanish Armada's attempted invasion of England. All available ships were being commandeered for national defense, making private colonial voyages impossible regardless of their urgency. Raleigh's attempts to secure permission for a relief expedition to Roanoke were repeatedly denied by royal officials, who considered the defense of England itself more important than the survival of distant colonial settlements. White was forced to wait through the winter of 1587 to 1588 while the colonists he had left behind faced their first American winter without adequate supplies or reliable food sources. The Spanish Armada crisis of 1588 consumed England's naval resources throughout the year, effectively isolating the Roanoke colonists during the critical period when they most needed support. Even after the defeat of the Armada in the summer of 1588, the continuing war with Spain made colonial ventures difficult and dangerous. Spanish ships were actively patrolling American waters, and any English vessels carrying supplies to American settlements risked capture or destruction. White's personal agony during this period is evident in his surviving correspondence, where he repeatedly expresses his torment at being unable to return to his daughter and granddaughter. He made several unsuccessful attempts to organize private relief expeditions, but these efforts were hampered by lack of funding, government restrictions, and the practical difficulties of organizing ocean voyages during wartime conditions. The few ships that Raleigh was able to send toward Roanoke during 1588 and 1589 were turned back by Spanish naval activity or diverted to privateering operations that offered more immediate profits than colonial relief. These expeditions' failure to reach Roanoke meant that the colonists received no communication from England for almost 3 years, leaving them completely isolated and presumably convinced that they had been permanently abandoned. When White was finally able to organize a voyage to Roanoke in 1590, the expedition was a small private venture rather than the large relief effort that had originally been planned. The delay had made any large-scale supply mission pointless, as no colonial settlement could have survived 3 years without support. White's voyage was essentially a rescue mission intended to evacuate any surviving colonists rather than to reinforce a thriving settlement. The ships that carried White back to Roanoke in 1590 were primarily engaged in privateering operations against Spanish shipping, with the Roanoke visit serving as a secondary objective. This arrangement reflected the economic realities of late 16th century colonial ventures, where profitable activities like privateering had to subsidize less immediately lucrative endeavors like colonial settlement and relief. White's arrival at Roanoke on August 15, 1590, after an absence of almost exactly 3 years, revealed the mystery that has captivated historians and popular imagination for over 4 centuries. The settlement was completely deserted, with no sign of the 115 colonists who had been left behind. The houses had been carefully dismantled rather than destroyed by violence, suggesting that the departure had been planned and voluntary rather than the result of attack or disaster. The only clues to the colonists' fate were carved messages that followed the communication protocols that White had established before his departure. The letters CRO were carved into a tree near the settlement, and the word Croatoan was carved into a post of the fort. According to the prearranged signals, These carvings indicated that the colonists had relocated to Croatoan Island, about 50 miles south of Roanoke. The absence of a cross above the carved words suggested that the move had not been made under duress. Croatoan Island, known today as Hatteras Island, was the home of a Native American community led by Manteo, who had remained friendly to English interests throughout the previous conflicts. The island offered several advantages over Roanoke as a settlement site, including better access to maritime resources, more diverse ecological zones for gathering wild foods, and an established Native American community that might provide support and protection. White's attempt to reach Croatoan and locate the missing colonists was frustrated by severe weather that damaged his ship's anchor cable and made navigation in the shallow waters around the Outer Banks extremely dangerous. After several days of unsuccessful attempts to reach Croatoan, White was forced to abandon the search and return to England when his ship's captain declared that continuing the mission would risk the loss of the entire expedition. White's failure to complete the search for the missing colonists has been criticized by many historians as the loss of a crucial opportunity to solve the mystery of their disappearance. However, White's own account suggests that the decision to abandon the search was made by the ship's captain rather than by White himself, and that White was essentially a passenger without authority to overrule decisions made for the ship's safety. The mystery of the Lost Colony of Roanoke has generated hundreds of theories and explanations over the past 4 centuries, ranging from historically plausible scenarios to wild speculation involving everything from Spanish attacks to supernatural disappearances. The lack of definitive archaeological or documentary evidence has allowed the mystery to persist and grow in popular imagination while frustrating scholarly attempts to reach definitive conclusions. The most historically plausible explanations for the colonists' disappearance center on their integration with local Native American communities. The carving of Croatoan strongly suggests that at least some colonists relocated to Manteo's community on Hatteras Island, where they might have been welcomed as valuable allies bringing European technology and knowledge. Intermarriage between English colonists and Native Americans would have been a logical survival strategy that provided cultural and economic advantages for both groups. Archaeological evidence from Hatteras Island includes European artifacts from the appropriate time period, though these could have arrived through trade rather than direct settlement. More significantly, oral traditions among modern Native American communities include stories of ancestors who may have been descended from the lost colonists, though these traditions are difficult to verify through conventional historical methods. Recent genetic studies have attempted to trace possible connections between modern Native American populations and the missing Roanoke colonists. Some preliminary results have suggested European genetic markers in communities that trace their ancestry to the coastal Carolina region, but these findings remain inconclusive and controversial within the scientific community. The complexity of population movements and intermarriage patterns over 4 centuries makes it extremely difficult to establish clear genetic links to specific historical events. Another significant theory suggests that the Roanoke colonists may have attempted to reach the Chesapeake Bay region, where they had originally planned to establish their settlement. This theory is supported by accounts from the later Jamestown colonists, who reported finding evidence of European presence in the Chesapeake region and received stories from local Native Americans about pale-skinned people who had lived among tribal communities. Captain John Smith, who led the Jamestown colony established in 1607, made several attempts to investigate reports of survivors from the lost colony. Native American informants told Smith's men about European-looking people who lived among tribes in the interior of Virginia and North Carolina. Some of these reports described people who could speak English but had adopted Native American customs and dress, exactly what might be expected of Roanoke survivors who had integrated into indigenous communities. The Jamestown colonists also discovered what they interpreted as evidence of European settlement in areas where no known colonies had been established. These findings included metal tools of European manufacture, architectural features that suggested European building techniques, and agricultural practices that seemed to combine European and Native American methods. While these discoveries could have resulted from trade relationships rather than direct settlement, they provided tantalizing hints that some Roanoke colonists might have survived and established new communities. The Spanish colonial records also provide intriguing clues about the fate of the Roanoke colonists. Spanish intelligence networks in the Caribbean and along the North American coast were extensive and effective, and Spanish officials were deeply concerned about English colonial activities that might threaten Spanish territorial claims or provide bases for attacks against Spanish shipping. Spanish documents from the 1590s include several references to English colonists who had been captured or had surrendered to Spanish authorities. Some of these references describe people who claimed to be from Roanoke and who provided detailed information about English colonial activities. However, these documents are often fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, making it difficult to determine which accounts refer to actual Roanoke survivors and which might describe other English people who had been in the region for various purposes. The possibility that some Roanoke colonists were captured by Spanish forces and taken to Spanish settlements in Florida or the Caribbean has been investigated by several historians. Spanish colonial policy generally encouraged the conversion and integration of captured enemies rather than their execution. So Roanoke survivors who fell into Spanish hands might have been absorbed into Spanish colonial society rather than killed. However, extensive searches of Spanish colonial records have failed to produce definitive evidence of Roanoke survivors in Spanish territories. A more tragic possibility is that the Roanoke colonists fell victim to the regional conflicts that were escalating throughout the late 16th century between different Native American groups. The arrival of European diseases had severely disrupted traditional population balances and alliance patterns, creating conditions for increased warfare and territorial disputes. European weapons and metal tools had also changed the nature of Native American conflicts, making them more deadly and less likely to be resolved through traditional diplomatic means. The colonists' association with Manteo and the Croatoan community might have made them targets for other Native American groups who viewed Croatoan cooperation with the English as treason or threats to their own territorial interests. If the colonists were caught up in such conflicts, they might have been killed or scattered in ways that left no archaeological traces for future investigators to discover. Environmental factors may also have played a crucial role in the colonists' disappearance. The late 16th century was a period of significant climate change, with what climatologists call the Little Ice Age creating cooler temperatures and more severe storms throughout the North Atlantic region. These changes would have made survival more difficult for European colonists who were already struggling to adapt to American environmental conditions. Tree-ring studies from the Roanoke region suggest that the late 1580s and early 1590s were marked by severe drought conditions that would have made agriculture extremely difficult and reduced the availability of wild food sources that the colonists might have depended upon for survival. Such drought conditions would have created competition for limited resources that might have led to conflicts with Native American communities or forced the colonists to relocate to areas where water and food were more readily available. Archaeological investigations at Roanoke Island have been complicated by centuries of development, erosion, and environmental change that have destroyed or buried much of the evidence from the original settlement. The sandy soils of the Outer Banks are particularly poor at preserving organic materials, meaning that many of the artifacts that might provide clues about the colonists' daily life and ultimate fate have decomposed beyond recognition. Despite these challenges, archaeological work at Roanoke has produced some significant discoveries. Excavations have revealed the foundations of several buildings from the colonial period, confirming the location of the settlement and providing insights into how the colonists organized their community. These findings have also revealed evidence of the colonists' attempts to adapt European building techniques to American materials and conditions. More intriguingly, archaeologists have discovered evidence that suggests the settlement was deliberately dismantled, rather than destroyed by violence or abandoned in panic. Building materials appear to have been carefully removed and presumably transported elsewhere, supporting the theory that the colonists voluntarily relocated rather than disappeared due to disaster or attack. This evidence aligns with the carved messages that White discovered, suggesting a planned departure rather than a mysterious vanishing. Recent archaeological work has extended beyond Roanoke Island to investigate potential sites where the colonists might have relocated. Excavations at Hatteras Island have revealed European artifacts from the appropriate time period, though these could represent trade goods rather than direct evidence of English settlement. More promising are discoveries of artifacts that appear to show European influence on Native American technology, such as metal tools that have been modified using Native American techniques or pottery that combines European and Native American design elements. The development of new archaeological technologies has opened exciting possibilities for solving the Roanoke mystery. Ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing techniques allow archaeologists to identify potential excavation sites without extensive digging. DNA analysis of human remains, when available, can provide definitive evidence of European ancestry even when other archaeological evidence is ambiguous. Underwater archaeology has also emerged as a promising avenue for Roanoke research. The waters around the Outer Banks contain numerous shipwrecks from various periods, and some of these might be connected to the Roanoke expeditions. Discovery of ships that carried supplies or colonists could provide valuable information about the colony's final period and might even contain artifacts or documents that shed light on the colonists' fate. The mystery of the Lost Colony has had a profound impact on American culture and historical imagination that extends far beyond its actual historical significance. Roanoke has become a symbol of the precarious nature of early European settlement in America and the complex relationships between colonizers and indigenous peoples that characterized the colonial period. The story of Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America who disappeared along with the rest of the colony, has become particularly powerful in American folklore. Virginia Dare has been transformed from a historical infant about whom almost nothing is known into a legendary figure representing American innocence, vulnerability, and the mysterious connections between European and Native American cultures. This mythologization of the Lost Colony reflects broader patterns in how Americans have understood their colonial origins. The Roanoke story allows for romantic speculation about peaceful integration between European and Native American peoples while avoiding the more difficult questions about conquest, displacement, and cultural destruction that characterized most actual colonial encounters. The Roanoke mystery has also provided rich material for literary and artistic expression. Countless novels, plays, poems, and films have offered their own solutions to the puzzle of the colonists' disappearance, usually reflecting the cultural concerns and assumptions of their own time periods rather than serious historical investigation. Early 20th century treatments of the Roanoke story often emphasize themes of racial purity and cultural superiority, suggesting that the colonists either heroically maintained their English identity despite impossible circumstances or tragically succumbed to the corrupting influences of wilderness life. More recent interpretations have explored themes of cultural adaptation and mutual accommodation, reflecting changing attitudes toward Native American peoples and colonial history. The development of Roanoke as a tourist destination has added another layer to the story's cultural impact. The outdoor drama, The Lost Colony, which has been performed on Roanoke Island every summer since 1937, presents a romanticized version of the colonists' story that emphasizes heroic sacrifice and mysterious disappearance, while largely ignoring the political and economic factors that made the colony's failure almost inevitable. Archaeological sites connected to the Roanoke story have become important cultural resources that must balance historical preservation with public education and tourism development. The challenge of presenting complex and often ambiguous historical evidence to public audiences while maintaining scientific integrity has led to innovative approaches to museum design and historical interpretation. The broader historical context of the Roanoke mystery reveals how the colony's failure reflected systemic problems with English colonial policy and practice that would continue to plague settlement efforts well into the 17th century. Raleigh's approach to colonization was essentially medieval, based on assumptions about personal loyalty and feudal obligation that proved inadequate for the realities of American settlement. The Roanoke expeditions were underfunded, inadequately planned, and poorly coordinated with broader English foreign policy objectives. The colonists were expected to become self-sufficient almost immediately while also serving English strategic interests, a combination of expectations that proved impossible to fulfill. The failure to establish reliable communication and supply lines between England and the colony made long-term survival unlikely regardless of the colonists' individual capabilities or dedication. Most significantly, English colonial policy showed little understanding of Native American political systems or cultural values, leading to diplomatic failures that made peaceful coexistence increasingly difficult. The English assumption that superior technology would automatically translate into political authority proved to be profoundly mistaken and contributed directly to the conflicts that destroyed the possibility of successful settlement at Roanoke. The lessons learned from Roanoke's failure influenced the planning and organization of later English colonial ventures, though not always in positive ways. The Virginia Company's approach to establishing Jamestown incorporated some corrections to Raleigh's mistakes, including better funding, more systematic planning, and clearer organizational structures. However, the Jamestown colonists also inherited many of Raleigh's assumptions about Native American relationships and land rights, leading to conflicts that would ultimately prove even more devastating than those that had destroyed Roanoke. The survival of Jamestown, despite experiencing starvation, disease, and warfare that were arguably more severe than anything the Roanoke colonists faced, demonstrates that successful English colonization required sustained commitment of resources and political will that had not been available during the Roanoke period. The 15-year gap between Roanoke's abandonment and Jamestown's establishment allowed England to develop more sophisticated colonial techniques and to commit greater resources to American ventures. The establishment of Plymouth in 1620 reflected even more systematic learning from early colonial failures, including those at Roanoke. The Plymouth colonists brought more appropriate skills for New England conditions, established better relationships with some Native American communities, and received more consistent support from England than any of the Roanoke expeditions had enjoyed. However, the ultimate success of English colonization in North America depended primarily on factors that had nothing to do with improved planning or cultural sensitivity. The devastating impact of European diseases on Native American populations created opportunities for European settlement that would not have existed under pre-contact demographic conditions. The development of profitable agricultural systems based on tobacco cultivation provided economic incentives for sustained colonial investment that the Roanoke expeditions had lacked. The relationship between the Roanoke mystery and broader patterns of colonial development reveals how individual historical events reflect larger social, economic, and political forces. The fate of the Lost Colony cannot be understood in isolation from the broader context of European expansion, Native American responses to colonial pressure, and the environmental and demographic changes that European contact initiated throughout North America. Modern research into the Roanoke mystery continues to benefit from advances in archaeological science, historical methodology, and interdisciplinary collaboration. Genetic studies of modern Native American populations have become increasingly sophisticated and may eventually provide definitive evidence about whether Roanoke colonists were absorbed into indigenous communities. Climate reconstruction techniques allow researchers to understand the environmental challenges that the colonists faced with unprecedented precision. Collaborative research involving historians, archaeologists, geneticists, climatologists, and Native American communities has opened new avenues for investigation while also raising important questions about research ethics and cultural sensitivity. The Roanoke story has traditionally been told from European perspectives that marginalize Native American experiences and viewpoints, and contemporary researchers are working to develop more inclusive approaches that acknowledge the complexity of cross-cultural encounters. Digital technologies have revolutionized both the conduct and the presentation of Roanoke research. Database integration allows researchers to combine information from multiple sources and identify patterns that might not be visible when sources are examined in isolation. Three-dimensional modeling and virtual reality techniques enable new ways of visualizing archaeological sites and testing hypotheses about colonial life and activities. The globalization of historical research has also provided new comparative contexts for understanding the Roanoke experience. Studies of colonial encounters in other parts of the world have revealed patterns of cultural adaptation, resistance, and accommodation that provide frameworks for interpreting the limited evidence about what happened to the Lost Colony. These comparative studies suggest that the integration of European colonists into indigenous communities was more common than traditional historical narratives have acknowledged. Recent discoveries related to other early colonial sites have provided additional context for understanding the challenges that the Roanoke colonists would have faced. Archaeological work at Jamestown has revealed the extent of mortality and suffering that early colonists experienced even when they received more support than the Roanoke settlers ever enjoyed. Excavations at Spanish colonial sites in Florida have shown how European colonists adapted to American conditions and established relationships with Native American communities under different cultural and political circumstances. The ongoing search for evidence about the Lost Colony reflects broader changes in how historical research is conducted and presented to public audiences. The traditional model of individual scholars working in isolation has given way to collaborative teams that bring together diverse expertise and perspectives. Historical research has become more interactive and accessible, with digital platforms allowing broader participation in both the conduct and interpretation of historical investigation. Educational applications of Roanoke research demonstrate how historical mysteries can serve as vehicles for teaching critical thinking skills and historical methodology. Students working with Roanoke materials must evaluate competing sources of evidence, consider multiple possible explanations for ambiguous data, and understand how historical interpretation reflects the assumptions and limitations of different time periods and cultural perspectives. The ethical dimensions of Roanoke research have become increasingly prominent as scholars recognize that historical investigation inevitably involves contemporary political and cultural concerns. Questions about who has the authority to interpret the past, how research results should be presented to different audiences, and what obligations researchers have to descendant communities affect every aspect of contemporary historical work. Native American perspectives on the Roanoke story have often been marginalized or ignored in traditional historical accounts, but contemporary research increasingly recognizes the importance of indigenous viewpoints and oral traditions. Native American scholars and community leaders have provided crucial insights into how the colonial encounter might have been understood from indigenous perspectives, and how the survival strategies available to the Roanoke colonists might have depended on their willingness to adapt to Native American cultural expectations. The question of whether solving the Roanoke mystery would actually serve useful historical or contemporary purposes has become part of the scholarly discussion about the significance of the Lost Colony. Some researchers argue that the mystery has become more historically important than whatever actually happened to the colonists, as it has provided a framework for exploring broader questions about cultural contact, adaptation, and survival that are relevant to many different historical situations. The development of heritage tourism around the Roanoke story has created both opportunities and challenges for historical education and preservation. Tourism provides funding for archaeological research and historical preservation, but it also creates pressure to present simplified or sensationalized versions of complex historical events. The challenge of making historical research accessible and engaging without compromising scholarly integrity continues to shape how the Roanoke story is presented to public audiences. Environmental changes in the Outer Banks region since the 16th century have significantly altered the landscape where the Roanoke colony was established, making it more difficult to understand the conditions that the colonists would have encountered. Sea level rise, erosion, and human development have destroyed or buried many potential archaeological sites. Climate change continues to alter the ecology of the region, making it challenging to understand how the environment might have influenced colonial survival strategies. The preservation of Roanoke-related archaeological sites faces ongoing challenges from natural disasters, development pressure, and inadequate funding for long-term maintenance. Hurricane damage has repeatedly threatened archaeological sites in the Outer Banks region, and rising sea levels will likely make preservation even more difficult in the future. The integration of archaeological preservation with environmental protection and tourism development requires careful planning and sustained commitment from multiple stakeholders. International collaboration has become increasingly important for Roanoke research as scholars recognize that the colonial encounter involved multiple national and cultural perspectives. Spanish colonial records contain valuable information about English activities in North America, while English documents provide insights into Spanish colonial policies and practices. Native American oral traditions preserved in various tribal communities contribute perspectives that are not available in any written sources from the colonial period. The role of speculation and imagination in historical interpretation has become a central issue in contemporary discussions about the Roanoke mystery. The absence of definitive evidence about the colonists' fate has created space for numerous theories and explanations, but it has also raised questions about the difference between legitimate historical hypothesis and unfounded speculation. The challenge of maintaining scholarly rigor while acknowledging the limitations of available evidence continues to shape how researchers approach the Lost Colony question. Technological applications of Roanoke research extend beyond archaeology to include digital humanities projects that use computational methods to analyze historical sources and identify patterns that might not be visible through traditional research methods. Text mining of colonial documents has revealed previously unnoticed connections between different sources, while statistical analysis of archaeological data has suggested new hypotheses about colonial activities and survival strategies. The psychological appeal of historical mysteries like Roanoke reflects deeper human needs for narrative closure and comprehensible explanations for complex events. The Lost Colony story provides a framework for exploring themes of survival, adaptation, and cultural encounter that resonate with contemporary concerns about globalization, immigration, and cultural identity. The enduring popularity of the mystery suggests that it serves functions beyond historical education or scholarly investigation. Popular culture treatments of the Roanoke story continue to evolve as contemporary concerns and interests change. Recent novels, films, and television programs have explored themes of environmental sustainability, cultural adaptation, and indigenous rights that reflect current social and political concerns. These creative treatments often provide insights into how different generations understand colonial history and its relationship to contemporary issues. The globalization of historical consciousness has made the Roanoke story part of broader international discussions about colonialism, cultural encounter, and historical memory. Scholars from different national and cultural backgrounds bring different perspectives to the interpretation of colonial encounters, enriching understanding while also revealing how historical interpretation reflects contemporary concerns and assumptions. Gender analysis has provided new insights into the Roanoke story by highlighting the experiences of women and children in colonial settings. The presence of families in the 1587 expedition created different survival challenges and opportunities than earlier military expeditions had faced. the specific vulnerabilities and resources that women and children brought to colonial situations may have influenced the colonists' survival strategies and ultimate fate. Economic analysis of the Roanoke expeditions reveals how financial constraints and profit expectations shaped colonial planning and influenced the colonists' experiences. The underfunding of the Roanoke expeditions reflected broader problems with English colonial investment that would continue to affect settlement efforts throughout the early colonial period. The failure to establish profitable economic activities contributed directly to the colony's inability to sustain itself and maintain connections with England. Military analysis of the Roanoke expeditions demonstrates how English military technology and tactics proved inadequate for American conditions. The colonists' military preparations reflected European warfare assumptions that did not translate effectively to colonial situations. The failure to develop appropriate military strategies for colonial defense contributed to the deterioration of relationships with Native American communities and may have influenced the colonists' ultimate decision to abandon their settlement. Agricultural analysis of the Roanoke attempts reveals how European farming techniques proved inadequate for coastal Carolina conditions. The colonists' agricultural failures reflected both environmental challenges and cultural limitations that would affect English colonization efforts throughout the early colonial period. Understanding these agricultural dimensions provides insights into the practical challenges that determined colonial survival and success. Anthropological perspectives on the Roanoke story emphasize the complexity of cross-cultural encounters and the various strategies that different groups developed for managing cultural contact. The range of possible outcomes for European Native American encounters was much broader than traditional historical narratives have suggested, and the Roanoke colonists might have pursued survival strategies that involved significant cultural adaptation and integration. The linguistic dimensions of the Roanoke story have received increased attention as scholars recognize the importance of language in cross-cultural communication and adaptation. The colonists' ability to learn Native American languages and Native Americans' acquisition of English would have been crucial factors in determining the success of diplomatic relationships and cultural accommodation. The limited evidence about linguistic exchange provides tantalizing hints about the nature of colonial indigenous relationships. Religious aspects of the Roanoke story reflect the complex role that Christianity played in English colonial ideology and practice. The colonists' religious beliefs influenced their understanding of their mission and their relationships with Native American peoples, while Native American religious traditions provided frameworks for understanding and responding to European contact. The intersection of different religious systems may have created opportunities for accommodation or sources of conflict that influenced the colony's ultimate fate. Medical aspects of the Roanoke expeditions highlight the health challenges that European colonists faced in American environments. Disease, malnutrition, and injuries posed constant threats to colonial survival, while limited medical knowledge and inadequate supplies made effective treatment difficult. Understanding the medical dimensions of colonial life provides insights into the practical challenges that determine survival and success. Geographic analysis of the Roanoke site reveals both the advantages and disadvantages that influenced the colonists' experiences. The location provided strategic and economic benefits, but it also created challenges for agriculture, defense, and communication that may have been insurmountable given the resources and knowledge available to 16th-century colonists. Modern geographic techniques allow researchers to understand these environmental factors with unprecedented precision. Transportation analysis of the Roanoke expeditions demonstrates how the logistics of ocean travel and coastal navigation influenced colonial planning and limited colonial options. The difficulty and expense of maintaining communication between England and America created vulnerabilities that affected every aspect of colonial life. Understanding these transportation challenges provides context for the isolation and abandonment that ultimately characterized the Roanoke experience. The legacy of the Roanoke mystery in American historical consciousness reflects broader patterns in how Americans have understood their colonial origins and their relationships with indigenous peoples. The romanticization of the Lost Colony has served various political and cultural purposes throughout American history, from justifying territorial expansion to promoting tourism development. These uses of the Roanoke story reveal how historical narratives are shaped by contemporary needs and assumptions rather than simply reflecting past realities. Educational applications of the Roanoke mystery have expanded beyond traditional history courses to include interdisciplinary programs that combine history, archaeology, anthropology, environmental science, and other fields. Students working with Roanoke materials develop skills in critical analysis, evidence evaluation, and hypothesis testing that are valuable across many academic and professional contexts. The mystery provides an engaging framework for teaching research methodology and historical thinking skills. The development of digital archives and databases has revolutionized access to primary sources related to the Roanoke expeditions. Previously scattered documents are now available to researchers worldwide, enabling new forms of collaborative investigation and analysis. Digital tools also allow for new ways of visualizing and analyzing historical data, from mapping colonial routes to modeling population dynamics. Contemporary DNA research has opened exciting possibilities for tracing connections between modern populations and the lost colonists. Advanced genetic analysis techniques can potentially identify European ancestry in Native American populations with unprecedented precision, though the interpretation of such findings remains complex and controversial. The ethical implications of genetic research involving indigenous communities require careful consideration of consent, ownership, and cultural sensitivity issues. Climate reconstruction studies have provided detailed information about environmental conditions during the late 16th century that help explain the challenges the Roanoke colonists faced. Severe drought conditions during the late 1580s would have made agriculture extremely difficult and created competition for limited water resources. Understanding these environmental factors provides crucial context for evaluating different theories about the colonists' fate. Underwater archaeology has emerged as a promising avenue for Roanoke research, as shipwrecks in the waters around the Outer Banks may contain artifacts or evidence related to the colonial expeditions. Advanced diving technology and remote sensing equipment allow archaeologists to investigate previously inaccessible sites. Discoveries of ships or cargo related to the Roanoke expeditions could provide valuable new insights into the colonists' experiences and ultimate fate. The integration of Native American oral traditions into scholarly research about Roanoke has challenged traditional hierarchies of historical evidence that privileged written sources over oral traditions. Native American communities have preserved stories and cultural knowledge that provide unique perspectives on the colonial encounter. However, incorporating oral traditions into academic research requires careful attention to cultural protocols and community consent. International comparative studies of colonial encounters have provided new frameworks for understanding the Roanoke experience. Similar patterns of cultural contact, adaptation, and accommodation occurred in many different global contexts during the early modern period. These comparative perspectives suggest that the integration of European colonists into indigenous communities was more common than traditional narratives have acknowledged. The role of women in the Roanoke story has received increased scholarly attention as historians recognize that gender dynamics significantly influenced colonial experiences. The presence of English women and children in the 1587 expedition created different survival challenges and opportunities than earlier male-only expeditions had faced. Women's reproductive capabilities, domestic skills, and cultural knowledge may have influenced survival strategies and relationships with Native American communities. Economic factors underlying the Roanoke expeditions reveal how financial pressures and profit expectations shaped colonial planning and contributed to ultimate failure. Raleigh's investment in the expeditions represented enormous personal financial risk, and the pressure to achieve quick returns influenced decisions about colonial organization and activities. The failure to identify profitable economic activities sustainable in the American environment contributed directly to the colony's inability to maintain itself. Military aspects of the Roanoke story demonstrate how European warfare assumptions proved inadequate for American colonial conditions. The colonists' military preparations were designed for European-style conflicts rather than the guerrilla warfare and diplomatic complexities they actually encountered. The failure to develop appropriate military strategies for colonial defense contributed to deteriorating relationships with Native American communities and may have influenced the ultimate decision to abandon the settlement. Technological transfer between European and Native American communities during the Roanoke period reveals the complex dynamics of cultural exchange. Native Americans were interested in European metal tools, weapons, and other manufactured goods, while Europeans needed Native American knowledge of local environments and survival techniques. The extent of technological exchange may have influenced the colonists' survival strategies and their integration into indigenous communities. Agricultural challenges faced by the Roanoke colonists highlight the difficulties of adapting European farming techniques to American environmental conditions. The sandy soils and coastal climate of the Outer Banks required agricultural methods that differed significantly from those the colonists had learned in England. Failure to develop successful agricultural systems left the colonists dependent on uncertain food sources and contributed to their vulnerability. Religious dimensions of the Roanoke story reflect the complex role that Christianity played in English colonial ideology and Native American responses to European contact. English colonists viewed their mission partly in religious terms, as opportunities to spread Christianity among indigenous peoples. Native American religious traditions provided frameworks for understanding and responding to European contact that may have influenced the possibilities for accommodation or conflict. Linguistic aspects of the colonial encounter have received increased scholarly attention as researchers recognize the crucial importance of communication in determining the success or failure of cross-cultural relationships. The colonists' ability to learn Native American languages and Native Americans' acquisition of English skills would have significantly influenced diplomatic relationships and survival possibilities. Evidence of linguistic exchange provides insights into the nature and extent of cultural interaction. Medical challenges faced by the Roanoke colonists reflect the harsh realities of survival in unfamiliar environments with limited resources and knowledge. European diseases affected Native American populations dramatically, while American environmental conditions posed health challenges for European colonists. Understanding the medical dimensions of colonial life provides context for evaluating survival strategies and ultimate outcomes. Geographic analysis of the Roanoke site using modern techniques has revealed both advantages and disadvantages that influenced colonial experiences. The location provided strategic benefits for defense and trade, but it also created significant challenges for agriculture, water supply, and communication with England. Advanced geographic information systems allow researchers to model environmental conditions and understand spatial relationships with unprecedented precision. The development of heritage tourism around Roanoke sites has created opportunities for public education while also raising questions about the commercialization of historical tragedy. Tourist attractions must balance entertainment value with historical accuracy and cultural sensitivity. The challenge of presenting complex historical events to diverse audiences requires innovative approaches to interpretation and education. Archaeological preservation efforts face ongoing challenges from environmental change, development pressure, and limited funding. Hurricane damage, sea level rise, and coastal erosion threaten archaeological sites throughout the Outer Banks region. Long-term preservation requires sustained commitment from government agencies, academic institutions, and local communities. International collaboration in Roanoke research has expanded as scholars recognize that the colonial encounter involved multiple national and cultural perspectives that are documented in various archives worldwide. Spanish colonial records contain information about English activities, while Native American oral traditions preserved in various communities provide perspectives unavailable in written sources. Collaborative research methods enable more comprehensive investigation than any single national or disciplinary approach could achieve. The psychological appeal of historical mysteries like Roanoke reflects deeper human needs for narrative coherence and understandable explanations for complex events. The Lost Colony story provides a framework for exploring universal themes of survival, adaptation, and cultural encounter that resonate across different time periods and cultural contexts. The enduring popularity of the mystery suggests that it serves psychological and cultural functions beyond historical education. Popular culture representations of the Roanoke story continue to evolve as contemporary concerns and interests change. Recent creative treatments have explored themes of environmental sustainability, cultural identity, and indigenous rights that reflect current social and political discussions. These cultural productions often reveal more about contemporary attitudes toward colonialism and cultural difference than about actual historical events. The globalization of historical consciousness has made the Roanoke story part of broader international discussions about colonialism, cultural encounter, and historical memory. Scholars from different cultural backgrounds bring diverse perspectives to colonial history interpretation, enriching understanding while revealing how contemporary concerns influence historical interpretation. Feminist analysis of the Roanoke expeditions has highlighted gender dynamics that traditional male-centered narratives often overlooked. The experiences of women and children in colonial settings involved different vulnerabilities and resources than those faced by adult men. Gender relationships within the colony and between colonists and Native Americans may have significantly influenced survival strategies and ultimate outcomes. Environmental history approaches to the Roanoke story emphasize the crucial role that ecological factors played in determining colonial success or failure. Climate change, disease ecology, and resource availability created constraints and opportunities that shaped human choices and outcomes. Understanding environmental history provides essential context for evaluating different theories about what happened to the lost colonists. Archaeological science continues to develop new techniques that may eventually provide definitive answers to questions about the Roanoke mystery. Advanced dating methods, chemical analysis of artifacts, and DNA extraction from archaeological materials offer unprecedented opportunities for investigation. However, the application of new technologies must be balanced with respect for cultural values and community concerns about the treatment of ancestral materials. The ethics of historical research have become increasingly complex as scholars recognize that investigation of the past inevitably involves contemporary political and cultural concerns. Questions about who has authority to interpret historical events, how research results should be presented to different audiences, and what obligations researchers have to descendant communities affect every aspect of contemporary historical work. Cultural resource management around Roanoke sites requires balancing multiple competing interests including historical preservation, tourism development, environmental protection, and community needs. Sustainable approaches to heritage management must consider long-term preservation goals, while also addressing contemporary economic and social priorities. Educational technology has created new opportunities for presenting the Roanoke story to diverse audiences through interactive exhibits, virtual reality experiences, and online educational resources. Digital tools enable immersive historical experiences that can help people understand the challenges and choices faced by 16th-century colonists and Native Americans. However, technological sophistication must be balanced with historical accuracy and cultural sensitivity. The relationship between professional historians and amateur enthusiasts in Roanoke research reflects broader changes in how historical knowledge is produced and validated. Citizen science projects and crowdsourced research initiatives have contributed valuable insights while also raising questions about expertise and authority in historical interpretation. Collaborative approaches that combine professional expertise with community knowledge and enthusiasm offer promising models for future research. Interdisciplinary collaboration has become essential for comprehensive investigation of complex historical events like the Roanoke Mystery. Historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, climatologists, geneticists, and other specialists each contribute unique perspectives and methods that, when combined, provide more complete understanding than any single discipline could achieve independently. However, interdisciplinary collaboration requires careful attention to different methodological assumptions and communication strategies. The commercialization of the Roanoke Mystery through tourism, media productions, and commercial publications has both positive and negative effects on serious historical research. Commercial interest provides funding and public attention that can support legitimate investigation, but it also creates pressure for sensationalized or oversimplified presentations that may distort historical understanding. Managing the relationship between commercial and scholarly interests remains an ongoing challenge. Conservation challenges facing Roanoke-related sites reflect broader issues of heritage preservation in the context of climate change and development pressure. Rising sea levels, increasing storm intensity, and coastal erosion pose immediate threats to archaeological sites throughout the region. Long-term preservation strategies must address these environmental challenges, while also considering changing patterns of land use and economic development. Community engagement in Roanoke research has expanded beyond traditional academic public relationships to include meaningful collaboration with descendant communities, local residents, and cultural stakeholders. Participatory research methods that involve communities in defining research questions and interpreting results can produce more relevant and respectful investigation while also building support for preservation and education efforts. The digital humanities have opened new possibilities for analyzing and presenting Roanoke-related historical materials. Text mining, statistical analysis, network analysis, and visualization techniques enable researchers to identify patterns and relationships that might not be visible through traditional research methods. Digital archives and databases make primary sources accessible to global audiences while also enabling new forms of collaborative analysis. Legal aspects of Roanoke research involve complex questions about ownership and control of archaeological materials, intellectual property rights in historical interpretation, and the authority to make decisions about site preservation and access. Native American communities have legal rights to ancestral materials and cultural knowledge that must be respected in any research activities. Balancing legal requirements with research goals requires careful attention to consultation and consent processes. The sociology of historical knowledge production around the Roanoke Mystery reveals how social and cultural factors influence what questions researchers ask, what methods they use, and how they interpret evidence. The demographics of the research community, funding priorities, institutional pressures, and cultural assumptions all affect how historical investigation proceeds. Understanding these social dimensions of knowledge production is essential for evaluating research claims and identifying potential biases. International law and cultural heritage protection have evolved significantly since serious Roanoke research began, creating new frameworks for responsible investigation and preservation. International conventions on cultural property, indigenous rights, and archaeological ethics establish standards that affect how research can be conducted and how results should be shared. Compliance with international standards requires ongoing attention to changing legal and ethical requirements. The future of Roanoke research will likely depend on continued technological development, interdisciplinary collaboration, and community engagement. New archaeological techniques, genetic analysis methods, and digital tools will create opportunities for investigation that are impossible with current technology. However, Technological advancement must be combined with sustained commitment to ethical research practices and meaningful collaboration with all stakeholders. Environmental monitoring and climate research in the Outer Banks region provide ongoing insights into the conditions that affected historical populations and continue to shape preservation challenges. Long-term environmental data help researchers understand both historical climate conditions and future preservation needs. Climate change adaptation strategies for heritage sites must consider both immediate threats and long-term environmental trends. Educational outreach based on Roanoke research serves multiple purposes, including public education, tourism development, cultural preservation, and community building. Effective educational programs must balance entertainment value with historical accuracy while addressing diverse audience needs and interests. Evaluation of educational impact helps ensure that outreach efforts achieve their intended goals and serve community needs effectively. The globalization of cultural heritage consciousness has made the Roanoke story part of broader international discussions about colonialism, indigenous rights, and historical justice. International perspectives on colonial encounters provide comparative contexts for understanding the Roanoke experience while also challenging traditional Anglo-American interpretations of colonial history. Cross-cultural dialogue about historical interpretation can enrich understanding while also revealing different cultural values and priorities. As we reach the end of our journey through the labyrinthine mystery of Roanoke, we find ourselves not with definitive answers, but with a deeper appreciation for the complexity of human experience in times of profound cultural change and environmental challenge. The Lost Colony represents far more than a simple historical puzzle. It embodies the universal human struggles of survival, adaptation, and identity that continue to resonate in our interconnected but culturally diverse world. The 115 men, women, and children who vanished from Roanoke Island over 4 centuries ago were individuals with hopes, fears, dreams, and relationships that we can barely imagine across the vast gulf of time and cultural change. Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America, lived only a brief time in the historical record before disappearing into legend, yet her story continues to symbolize both the promise and the vulnerability of cross-cultural encounter. Whether the colonists died of disease, were killed in conflicts, integrated into Native American communities, relocated to other regions, or met some combination of these fates, their experience illuminates the profound challenges faced by all peoples navigating the uncertain terrain of cultural contact and environmental adaptation. Their story reminds us that survival often requires the courage to abandon familiar ways of life and embrace new forms of identity and community. The Native American peoples who encountered these English colonists were themselves facing unprecedented challenges as European contact disrupted traditional patterns of life, introduced devastating diseases, and created new political and economic pressures. Their responses to European colonization, ranging from accommodation to resistance to strategic adaptation, reflect the intelligence, creativity, and resilience that enabled indigenous communities to survive centuries of colonial pressure. The enduring fascination with the Roanoke mystery speaks to deeper human needs for narrative coherence and meaningful connection to the past. In an era of rapid globalization and cultural change, the Lost Colony story provides a framework for exploring questions about identity, belonging, and survival that remain profoundly relevant. The mystery invites us to consider how we might respond to our own challenges of cultural encounter and environmental change. Perhaps most importantly, the Roanoke story reminds us that history is not simply a collection of facts about the past, but an ongoing conversation between past and present that shapes how we understand ourselves and our relationships with others. The questions we ask about the Lost Colony reflect our own concerns about cultural diversity, environmental sustainability, and human adaptability. As research into the Roanoke mystery continues, combining traditional historical methods with cutting-edge technology and increasingly sophisticated understanding of cultural and environmental dynamics, we may eventually discover more definitive answers about what happened to the lost colonists. Yet regardless of what future investigations reveal, the story of Roanoke will continue to serve as a powerful reminder of both human vulnerability and human resilience in the face of uncertainty and change. The silent saga of Roanoke echoes across the centuries, whispering to us about the courage required to venture into unknown territories, the wisdom needed to adapt to unfamiliar circumstances, and the hope that sustains human communities through their darkest hours. In listening to these whispers from the past, we may discover insights that help us navigate our own journeys into an uncertain but promising future. If you found yourself captivated by this enduring mystery and want to explore more forgotten stories from history's shadows, please consider liking this video and subscribing to History Bedtime Stories. Your support helps us continue uncovering the fascinating, complex, and often mysterious tales that remind us that the past is never quite as simple as it first appears.